over. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming over to this session. In this session, what we are going to be talking about today is just outdated infrastructure. What does that mean? The title is The Strategic Design Accelerating Facility Planning, Turning Vision into Value. And what it's going to do is introduces a charrette-based master facility planning and how it can be used to align your infrastructure with care delivery needs, learning how to make strategic, cost-effective decisions that set your organization up for long-term success. So I turn this over to JD and Kim, and great. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Amy. So, Amy introduced us. My name is John Downs. I'm a principal and director at Stroudwater, have been here for 15 years, and prior to that was a partner inside of an architectural firm that did exclusively healthcare work, and I did primarily master facility planning. Not an architect by training. My undergraduate was actually in psychology, and the reason the architectural firm brought me in was to be able to kind of wrangle both the architects as well as the hospital administrators and clinicians in order to figure out what it was that they needed from a facility investment perspective. Cameron, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. Cameron Smith. I'm a consultant with Stroudwater. I've been with the firm just about 3 years now. Prior to that, I worked kind of in the process improvement quality space for two health systems here in the Illinois, Iowa market. Background in industrial engineering with an MBA, and looking forward to speaking with you all today.
Excellent. Thanks, Cam. So at the end of our session, what we're hoping to be able to do is think about what it means to evaluate market demand and what that means for facility needs. And we'll talk a little bit about how we take that market data and volume to look at future infrastructure requirements. We'll talk a little bit about the master planning process. We've got a process that we developed at Stroudwater that really streamlines that, but we'll talk about the differences between the traditional master plan and what some of the more streamlined master plans might look like. And then finally, really looking at what are the keys to a successful master plan, recognizing the strategic, operational, financial factors that lead to good decisions, right? We have limited resources to be able to make decisions from a facility perspective in rural communities, even more so than in our urban and academic brothers and sisters out there. If we make a $5 million decision, it's the wrong direction, that could be catastrophic for us. If an urban center puts 5 million in, that's a much, much easier thing for them to absorb. So we really need to be high impact.
So, to kick off, we really want to get an understanding of when was the last time that you all completed a master plan for your facility. So we should see the poll launch here soon. However, I might need it.
We need to phone a friend, Cam?
We might need to phone a friend as I'm getting a failure to launch on my side.
Hey, Kim, I'm trying to launch those polls too, and it doesn't look like it's going to play along with. Oh, let's see.
Right.
Did it? I think we got it launched. Did it launch? Nope, it's not looking like it. I apologize.
Okay,
So we're going to
no
go
worries.
on.
So we won't do polls today, but that's okay.
If we did, this is what you would ask, right?
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. So, when we think about, what is the optimal approach to looking at facility master planning, I mentioned in the beginning, it starts with understanding what is the demand for services, current and future? What's happening as we shift from inpatient to outpatient? How does that impact our demand in our communities that we're serving? We have to evaluate the existing facility assets and the needs for phased investment or replacement. Most of our communities, we can't afford to just say, let's replace it. So we've got to think about how do we take baby steps in order to eventually get to what we're looking for. Identifying the major issues that have to get addressed today, while being flexible to address our issues in the future, and making sure that without anything else, we are financially sustainable. We cannot overinvest in facilities if it puts the hospital at risk of closure. So many of our communities that we're working with, when we see an investment, you may be the only hospital for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours drive to the next nearest. And if you do something that ends up making your hospital unsustainable, then that's not going to be good for the folks in your community. We also want to think about how do we model any of the investments we make, any of the expenditures that we have through our Medicare cost report, particularly as critical access hospitals. So there are a couple of different ways to do master facility planning. The first is a traditional master plan. That might take 3 to 6 months. We're going to look at every department. We're going to come out, we'll talk to you, go back, write up a report, come back 3 weeks later, show some diagrams, go back, do it again. And we get this comprehensive book of information. And in the 15 years that I was inside of an architectural firm, that's often how we did things. What we realized, though, is we typically knew that you, the client, the hospital, had particular needs that were relatively easy to quantify early on. It didn't matter if we were going into a detailed discussion about the biomedical engineering spaces needed 50 square feet more. That wasn't going to drive the plan. What was going to drive the plan were the things that touched patients. Doesn't mean that biomedical engineering wasn't important. It absolutely is, but it needs to be secondary to making sure we've got the right spaces. So what we said was, is there an opportunity to streamline that into something shorter? And we developed a 4 to 6 week charrette, which is a rapid design process, 4 to 6 week master facility planning process. Instead of looking at every single department, biomedical engineering, all of these other small little areas, we looked at the critical departments: inpatient, ED, diagnostic imaging, procedures, clinic. Those types of areas become absolutely critical for us to make our decisions. The engagement is very focused. It's a 1 week intensive on-site session to be able to develop the master facility plan, and it gives us a prioritized plan of action rather than a book that sits on a shelf for the next 5 years. The timeline, it's about a month to do the underlying market analysis, create the baseline drawings, and develop that initial financial model. Doesn't help anyone. How many times have we seen organizations where we've gone out and said, we are going to do a master facility plan, we want to do this, we want to do that, and the architect comes back and it's a $75 million project and you can afford $7 million. If we know that it's only $7 million of capacity, we don't want to go through a planning process, get everyone excited about something that is so far outside. What we can do, though, is build something so that 7 million today, 10 million tomorrow, 15 million in 16 years, that all work us towards an end goal that still sets the facility up for those best practices. The 1 week intensive on-site facilitation and charrette, interviewing folks, understanding the volume scenarios. What happens if we gain GI volume? What happens if we lose X, Y, and Z volume? What happens as inpatient volumes continue to decline? How do we deal with facility solutions and the financial outcomes of those things? And at the end of the week, we've got a pretty good deliverable. Then we package that up 2 or 3 weeks later with the final report. The overall process, we start by involving multidisciplinary stakeholders in a rapid process. It cannot just be the CEO, the COO, the CFO, and the facilities director. We need to engage others. We need our medical staff involved. We need our chief nursing officer involved. We often need, in rural communities, the board involved, because they're the folks that are going to talk to folks about mill levies. They're going to talk to folks about fundraising. The board needs to get involved early on. We identify facility priorities and financial abilities, understand the market needs today and in the future, and then look at what some of our short and long-term options are. If possible, and I'll share a specific example of this in a bit, if possible, we fast track immediate projects so that we're able to say, yes, we know the ED is a significant issue. Here's how you can go forward with the ED while you're still doing planning for other types of things. Ideally, we're trying to develop a long-range framework for the entire facility with phased investments that plug into it over time. And then we've got to be able to build out a pro forma financial model, including the impact to the Medicare cost report. I work with a whole bunch of hospitals that most of my clients are critical access hospitals, but I do work with a whole bunch of hospitals that are not critical access hospitals and do not get cost-based reimbursement. And a 51-bed hospital out in the middle of somewhere that has low volumes, that looks like a critical access hospital, smells like a critical access hospital, but doesn't get reimbursed the way that a critical access hospital does, cannot afford to do some of the projects that many of you all are able to do as a result of cost-based reimbursement. What's going to happen with that in the future? I'm not a crystal ball reader, but I'd like to believe that all of the cool heads will prevail and we will continue with cost-based reimbursement for our critical access hospitals. So what's the value of doing it faster rather than the traditional way? Number one is the efficient use of time. And I'd say the biggest thing is that you all, as hospital executives, have a day job, and that's providing care, running a hospital. You can't be thinking about, well, I'm going to talk about facilities this week, and then in 3 months, and then in 6 months, and we've got to get to an answer quickly. So we look for that efficient use of time, get it all done inside that week. Provide a long-range vision. I'll talk a little bit about that and what it means in a bit. Integrating the strategy, what you want to do, the operations, how you're going to do it, with the reality of finances. Can we do it? Is this something that's even possible for our organization? Where possible, we try to identify no regret moves. It may not be something that's mission critical, but if we need to expand in a particular area, build out, bump out our office space so that we can add some additional clinics, if that is not going to impact some other mission critical area of the hospital, it's a no regret move. If you've got the capacity, you've got the time, you've got the money, go ahead and do that. But other times we need to look at it and say, let's hold back just a little bit. We prioritize the need of the organization with phased implementation plans. The other piece that I would say from a planning perspective is getting independent advice is critical. Making sure that the advice you receive is not tied to, I am going to design you a building that costs $20 million and I'm going to get a 7% fee on that $20 million. You really want some independent advice that says, whether it's 20 million, 10 million, 5 million, 0 million, whatever it might be, here's the right thing for you. It's also critical, I mentioned this before, to incorporate broad perspectives. It's not just senior management. And it's not just for the emergency department. It's across the entire enterprise, the senior management, the medical staff, the board and community, departmental leadership. We often go through a process where we try to organize our departments or organize our groups of departments into categories: diagnostic and treatment, clinic, meetings, so on and so forth, and then ask a variety of folks throughout the organization their thoughts on those things. It's amazing. I was with Cameron actually at a larger hospital, still a sole community provider, but not a critical access hospital. And we were just sitting there chatting in the lunchroom about some facility issues. And someone came up to us and said, I'll tell you the one thing, it's parking. That's the problem here at this organization. It was just a patient that was happening to have a coffee at the same time at the table next to us. It made us think we should probably be speaking a little bit softer. But she knew that parking was a big issue for them. We knew it too, because we drove around looking for a space, but it became something even more critical that we needed to make sure management understood in that process. When we think about defining the need in an organization, it starts with what the market needs. And there are 4 levers. It doesn't matter if you are an FQHC, you're a critical access hospital, or you're Massachusetts General Hospital. The same 4 levers of demand modeling apply to all healthcare organizations. It starts with the population that you serve, right? The geography. Cameron will talk a little bit about this in a minute. Once we understand the population, at what rate do those folks utilize services? And that's changed over time, right? We've got inpatient care going down. We've got outpatient care going up. We've got insurance issues. We're trying to steer people in particular ways. We don't want you to come to the hospital. We do want you to come to the hospital. But if we think of all of the people in the community and the rate at which they use the service, that's 100% of the volume. The next lever is the share of that volume. What piece of it do we as an organization intend to pick up? Where are we today? Where do we want to be in the future? Sometimes we'll say, I want 0, right? I don't want to be in the transplant game as a critical access hospital. From the previous presentation, maybe I don't want to be in the obstetrics game. So I just assume a 0% market share and maybe a corresponding decline in my ultrasound and those types of services that might be supporting an OB program. Maybe I look at it and I say, we're not going to do inpatient OB, but we're going to support it on the outpatient side. And here's how we're going to do it. So we want a significantly higher share in the ultrasound side. But this one, we've got a little bit of control over because we can do things. We can fine tune our referral patterns and making sure that we are getting the piece of the market that we're looking for. The final lever in demand modeling, when we start to take the amount of stuff done to the amount of space or people or devices we need to be able to do it, is throughput. Those are our hours of operation, right? If I'm open 24 hours a day and I can see outpatients in any one of my spaces, then I've got a lot more capacity than if I'm only open 8 hours a day for outpatient care. If I can be more efficient bringing people through, it's not a 30-minute visit, it's a 20-minute visit. I can fit more volume in those types of things as well. But I've also got to think about some of the socioeconomic things. If I'm in an area where people have transportation challenges, they're more likely to be late or avoid or miss appointments. That means I need to think about an efficiency factor. I've got to think about an appointment missed factor, and that's going to impact my throughput assumptions. Cameron.
So, as John mentioned, we really need to first start with understanding what is our service area. And, the most precise way that we can do that is starting with patient origin data. And we can look at that by various types of services or other means. So we can say, do we want to understand by point of origin? Do we want to serve a county or a parish? Really, once we determine what that primary service area is, then we can look at, do we serve a secondary service area? Are there other ways we want to break this down? And once we have that defined service area, we really want to begin understanding everything there is to know about that particular service area, such as what the population looks like and what the population is we're serving. In this particular instance, you can see that over the next 5 years, the population's increasing at 5% or expected to increase at 5% over the next 5 years. More importantly, though, when we look at kind of the age cohorts, you can see 0 to 17, for example, is declining over the next 5 years. However, we've got 65 plus that's growing at a much higher rate compared to all the others. And we understand, as most of us do, the 65 plus cohort primarily are utilizers of healthcare services. So we know we've got a group of people who are going to be more reliant on our services that's increasing in size. We can also look at this service area and then say, just back one more slide, JD, sorry.
Sorry, Cameron.
We can look at this and say, where is the primary focus of our population? Is it spread out across a variety of our service area, of our geography, or is it condensed into, like as this example shows, 1 or 2 zip codes in particular? Once we really know that, then we can start looking at that kind of utilization, what's happening in the broader inpatient market. In this case, we see all boats are declining. We're expecting to see a 7.6% decline over the next 5 years in inpatient volume. However, when we think about facility planning, really the important number here is looking at that current days of 14,031. That translates into an average daily census of about 38.4 or so. So if we were to say we're going to take this service area and put a fence around it, nobody comes in, nobody comes out, and we could capture 100% of that market share, we know it's 38 people. That's really the first step. However, we know it's decreasing over time from an inpatient perspective. Are we going to make it up via market share growth? What does the next 5 years look like? Similarly, on the outpatient side, on this side, as JD mentioned, we see outpatient volumes increasing in almost every service line. The important thing here is when we think about service line kind of planning from a facility standpoint, we really want to look at all of the individual modalities specifically, taking imaging, X-ray, CT, ultrasound, mammo, and really start to understand those on an individual modality level because facility planning is done at that service line level. So in this case, we want to understand, are they growing over the next 5 years? Are they declining? In this case, they're growing. And then where's the site of service? Where are they happening at? Which is shown in those gray bars over on the right-hand corner. Once we really know the overall kind of trends of the market from an inpatient and outpatient side, we can then start to understand what's happening in our service area and what does that adjusted market size look like. So in this case, you'll see that, we have our primary service area estimate of 7,252 ED visits. But if we know that some people from our service that we're serving don't necessarily come from our primary service area. Somebody trips, they fall, they end up in our ED, not from our primary service area. Well, we've got to adjust for that somehow. So if we say 80% of the volume we get is from that primary service area, that then factors into a potential 1,800 others that we would consider in that market. So we come up with a total adjusted market size of 9,065. In facility planning, that's the important number to really look at, because that's the number that we'll need to then come up with our theoretical market share as we move forward. Then if we look at our own volume, so in this particular example, kind of keeping with the theme of the ED, our fiscal year 23, we know that that 6,194 is an accurate number because that's coming from our own patient records, our own visits, our own EMR. We're then comparing that with our adjusted market size to come up with a share of our adjusted market share of 68.3%. That then leads to a couple of questions. Do we have patients that are seeking services elsewhere, or are they getting that care in another fashion? Similarly, we'll look at this and you can say that we know that CT scans and mammography are doing quite well, where we've got 92 and 98% market share. So those are strong. And then we want to look at areas such as ultrasound, or in this example, X-ray, and say, what can we do to grow those services to gain market share? And then as we move forward and kind of think about what can we do with all of this data, we then really look at that fourth lever that JD mentioned, which is throughput. And we take that adjusted market size, and we'll put ED aside for the moment because they operate 24 hours a day. And we'll say, let's assume that our imaging modalities are operating at 12 hours a day, for X-ray 275 days a year, same with CT, and then MRI, ultrasound, and mammography are operating at 255 days. We then assign a general visit length, some efficiency measures, as JD mentioned, for no-shows or people who may be late. And that allows us to come up with a visits per room per year metric, which then we divide that adjusted market share size by those visits per room per year, and we can come up with some kind of baseline room need. Now, understanding that fractions don't work, we'll generally want to round up. But like JD mentioned earlier, this is where we have some control to really look at, are there efficiencies that we can create that allow us to, if we don't need that extra space, can we be available on weekends? Can we open our services to adjust for longer hours? Can we kind of make some adjustments with our throughput that allow us to not necessarily need to round up, but to find a way to accommodate that existing need? Then we really move on and we start planning that out into the future. And we look at the Meritive data, which assigns us an annual growth rate. In this case, all boats are rising in all the modalities except for inpatient surgery, which is decreasing. And then we apply that out 10 years into the future. From there, looking at if it's increasing, the number is likely higher. In the case of inpatient surgery, it's declining, it's going to be lower. We then look at some various scenarios. Do we want to have match Meritive's growth rate with the same market share that we have? Do we want to say, never mind, with the Meritive, we're just going to grow at 1% each year, and that's what it is? Or do we want to grow our market share points and match Meritive's growth rate, or something even more aggressive? In this particular case, that also feeds into facility planning when we start to think about what is the range of impact to the facility from one scenario to another. In this example, if you look at columns D and F, there really is not a major impact to the facility when you look at the ED visits of 7,044 to 7,434, likewise with X-ray, CT, MRI, and so on. So back to you, JD.
So when we start thinking about the facility itself, we've got to start by understanding the site. And that really begins with understanding who owns what pieces of the site. In this particular example, hospital owns all of the blue area, but there are single family homes that go along the backside. And obviously those are not areas that we'd be able to do something with. I call your attention though to the top corner here where our hospital is right up against the back lot line of the near provider or the near homeowner. And one of the things we might want to think about at some point is, does that make sense for us to pick up some additional land over in that area? That might become something that we think about from a master planning perspective. We also want to understand what is the age of the existing hospital. In this case, the original hospital was relatively new. I mean, I say it now, and it's many years out in the past, but it was built in 1985. And being in the Northeast, I typically see lots of hospitals that are still from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So 85 sounds new, but it's still pretty old. Then we had a nursing home that was added on in 92. There was a small addition made in 2004, and then a clinic building that was put in 2016. Obviously, we want to think about how do we invest around our newer spaces rather than our older spaces. The next thing we look at are development opportunities. When we just take a site plan and we look at that site and we understand the age of the buildings, we understand what the opportunities are, where could we expand to? So the darker blue here shows some of those areas that we've got an opportunity to expand, not yet defining what might go there, but here's what the site tells us. If we're not going to move to somewhere new, what might we be able to do? It's also really important for us to think internally in the building about the adjacencies of departments. And so what we've tried to do here is color code some things, kind of procedural, administration, beds. Beds are shown in red or in a lighter pink color here, really spread throughout the facility. And I'll point out the emergency room over here in green. It's not great color selection on our part, but looking at that emergency visit, one of the things that I just want to point out is, if I have to go from the ED over to the beds, I am crossing a public corridor. The public corridor is this peach color area here and the yellow area here. It's something we don't want to see. I don't want to see patients in public corridors going over to beds. Is there an opportunity to improve that adjacency long term? So when we look at a long-term site visit, if this hospital needed to grow their nursing home, there's an opportunity to do that relatively easy. They've got some land out to that side. On the acute care side, though, it's a lot more challenging. There are very few, absent picking up parcels, which we do show long term, of where they can expand. We've got a clinic that's in the top right-hand corner that could expand. We had the emergency department that could expand, but how do we start to deal with some of the other departments of the hospital? So it's important for us to develop a long-range plan. And what I would say, the number one thing to think about is avoiding scratching today's itch. Too many times we get on site and there was, hey, I needed to do this. We made this investment. We said, oh, it would have been great to not have made that investment, because now you're going to have to undo that in order to fix the long-term solution. So really, master planning enables us to think before scratching today's itch. We talked about the market analysis. We talked about our facility assets today and what our needs are. The next piece is really, what does today's project do to my flexibility in the future? If I'm trying to make an investment today, do I still have the ability to do the thing I can't afford today, but can I do it tomorrow? Going back, as I said in the beginning, asking, how can the cost report help? Is there something, as we build it through the cost report, that Medicare is going to pick up its portion? In some states, Medicaid is going to pick up its portion of that investment so that you can do it. The most important thing for a master plan is to identify where not to put a building. It's to mark those areas that say, I can't afford to do it today, but in the future, this is where I solve X, Y, and Z. This is where I solve my ED. This is where I solve my beds. This is where I solve something else. We're going to try to launch a poll. I think Amy might be able to get this going for us. She's going to give it a shot. And I'm going to give it 10 seconds, and then I'm going to move on. All right. Seeing no poll launched on my side, we're going to move on in the interest of time here. And so talking about some of the adjacency considerations that we think about, we know that we're always going to have an emergency entrance. We're going to have a main entrance, and ideally we're going to have a loading dock or kind of support entrance, but recognize that in many of our hospitals, the ED is the epicenter, right? I need to be able to get from the emergency department over to my beds, over to diagnostic imaging. If I do surgery, I need to be able to get there. So we need to think about how we can make sure the ED connects to all of those things without seeing duplication, because we can't necessarily afford any duplication. It's also really important where we can to minimize cross traffic. I used the example earlier with patients going from the ED over to beds. In the case here, this one works out really well. Here's their ED shown again in red. We can pop down a corridor. We're into the into the inpatient unit. That's great. If I'm going from the ED over to diagnostic imaging, I can access that. That's not a problem at all. In this particular hospital, if I wanted to get to the ORs, I've got to go, up to another level in order to have that. But I can do some of those things. They've got other adjacency issues in terms of an outpatient lobby here shown as north and south in this yellow public circulation area, but I can't connect those two lobbies. Right, I've got to go through patient units in order to do that. That's not going to work out. How can we fix some of that long term? When we think about looking at some of our options, here's an example. We're working with a client out in Wyoming where the ED was a significant issue. They had to improve it. They needed more space. They needed more treatment spaces. They also had some COVID funds. So it was use it or lose it. We've got to get it going. And their initial thought was, we're going to just build out. We have this available area that we'll build out. Said, okay, that might be all right, but let's think about it long term. So we came in, did a master facility plan. At the end of the week, had an answer that said that's really not the right spot to be able to go invest. Instead of building out where this hatched line is, what if we were to build new space or take over administrative space for the ED to come down towards the south, such that a second phase in the future, they weren't ready for it today, can't afford to do it yet. A second phase could be building a new inpatient unit that comes down to the south. That way, the ED patients weren't going to have to cross over into the old inpatient space, crossing public corridors. Now they could all be located in that area. It was a 10-year plan, not designed for today. But when I mentioned where not to build something, this area, it would be really important not to try to put something else there. Don't put a clinic there. Don't put something else that you don't want to knock down, because it's the one spot where we could solve long term. And so we had that phased investment. The first was the ED project with CARES funding. Second were a series of internal renovations. We're now doing surgery at this hospital. We renovated our lab. We expanded our kitchen, things that the hospital needed, but that weren't impacting other key clinical areas. Then the long term, we can do our inpatient unit. We can do a clinic addition. It's also really important for us to develop a financially sustainable plan, right? The cost report impact. How does the cost report help or hinder you from being able to do something? Do you have the financial reserves? When we're looking to do fundraising, we're going to go have a capital campaign. It's often easier to do that with a vision, because folks want to bet on the winning horse as opposed to, on an uncertain horse. We'd rather put our money with the school system. We'd rather give it to another hospital. Thinking about fundraising with a vision is really important, and understanding what are we even able to borrow if we needed to borrow. It's critical when we think about capital planning, though, and this, I'm not going to click on a poll because we know they don't work, but it's important when we think about capital planning. The capital planning is not just, what am I doing to replace the equipment in my imaging department? What am I doing to replace the equipment in, my inpatient unit? It's got to also be, what if I had to replace portions of my hospital? And oftentimes when we think about capital planning, the traditional capital planning reports, they don't think about the strategic investments. They think about replacement investments. And so it is important just to kind of keep that in your mind as you go forward. When you're doing master planning, it's the time for conservative budgeting. Don't be kind of pie in the sky. Oh, I can do this for $200 a square foot. Those days are over. Don't look back at Modern Healthcare or some other article that you've read that says, oh, well, this hospital replaced for $36 million 2 years ago. They replaced for $36 million 2 years ago. It's $70 million today. It's just the reality of the world. Things have gotten more expensive. Don't want to get into why, don't want to get into how, but understand that during master planning, we'd rather be conservative. It's important to think about, here's the construction cost, $700 a square foot times 8,600 square feet. or times 3,000 for dietary as an example, is a $2.1 million project. We also adjust. Some things are more expensive. If I'm doing surgery, that's $1,200 a square foot. On 14,000 square feet, that comes up to a much bigger number. But even if we're realistic there, we've also got to be realistic about our equipment, our furniture, our fixtures, architectural fees, all of those other things. Those become the markup numbers to get us to a total project cost. And then adding all of those together gets us to a cumulative project cost. We can then take those cumulative project costs, put them into a model to understand, all right, if we were borrowing, we had a $52 million project, we've got 15 million in either cash or donations, we're going to take a $37 million note at 6% over 35 years, we've got 24% cost-based reimbursement. What does it mean for us in our financial model? And then run that through a cost report to understand, here's what that looks like. We've got our incremental reimbursement and capital costs by adding this project in there. We've got our cash flow from operations. We may have some financial improvement opportunities, but where are we showing up relative to our debt service coverage ratio, which becomes an important thing for us to think about as we're going forward with the feasibility of any given project. Where does our money come from as we incorporate that capital planning, not just for our facility planning, but for all of those other things? I mentioned before, oftentimes people are doing their capital budgets for the replacement of equipment and not doing it on the strategic side where we're building new facilities. If we're making investments in new facilities, where might we be needing to add additional capital for either continued reinvestment in our existing facilities or in new facilities? I would suggest starting your capital process at the beginning of your master planning process. Do those hand in glove. Understand what it includes. Should we use local banks? Should we try programs like USDA? Are we lucky enough that we can just write a check? We've got cash to be able to make all of these things happen. That's what's important as we think about master facility planning. So it's understanding what we need, where we're trying to go, how much it's going to cost us to get there, and how can we make sure that we're sustainable going forward. Apologies for the polls not working, but any questions that came through, happy to answer those. I know we're a minute over.
So we did have a few questions come through, and if we can answer them now, since we are a little over, or we can wait and answer them afterwards, as we will be distributing to everyone both the recording as well as the deck and the Q&A, the questions and the answers to that. So is that good with you, JD?
Yeah, if there are a couple of questions, I'm happy to answer them
Yep.
now. Otherwise, I can do them and put them as part of the follow-up.
Yep. So I would say, since we are after the hour and had the issues with the polls, let's just do that afterwards then, if that would
Sure.
be good. And
That's
then
fine.
I just wanted to share, thank you, JD. Thank you, Cam, for working on this and presenting this information to us today, just to help set these facilities up for success. And to all of you who have been watching for a few hours today, or even just this session, thank you for spending this time with us. We had discussions about strengthening the ED response for behavioral health, the future of OB services, and facility investments. Today's discussions really highlighted the resilience and adaptability of rural hospitals. Don't forget, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our final sessions that will focus on performance improvement and building a sustainable provider strategy. So I will be here. Hope to see you as well. And thank you for joining us today.